The summer air in New Orleans in June of 1881 was heavy, almost liquid, with the thick perfume of magnolia and the slow hum of insects drifting through the city. In the old St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, people pressed together shoulder to shoulder, their clothes sticking to their skin, their eyes drawn to a single crypt among the tightly packed tombs. They came not only from the Creole neighborhoods, but also from the elegant houses of the French Quarter, from the riverfront shacks of freedmen, from the parishes beyond the city itself. Some brought rosaries, some flowers, some only their curiosity. They had come to see the final journey of Marie Laveau, the woman whispered of as the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans. Some remembered her as a healer, a woman of boundless charity. Others recalled stories of spells, of gris-gris bags, of serpents dancing in firelight. Rumors clung to her name like ivy to stone: saint, sorceress, witch, protector, traitor, savior. What was true, and what was legend, would be buried with her body. Yet the crowd was immense, stretching into the narrow streets because whatever she truly had been, she had touched the life of this city like no other. Before we step back in time to trace her journey from birth to legend, I want to pause and welcome you. This is Darkest Lives, and tonight we walk through memory, rumor, and history to rediscover the life of Marie Laveau. As we begin, I would love for you to tell me, down in the comments, where and when you are listening. Are you in a quiet room at night, or perhaps on a morning walk as the day awakens? Share your place in time, and do not forget to subscribe so that together we can wander through more lives that linger on the edge of myth and memory. And now let us return to that cemetery, that June day where her story ends, so that we may trace how it first began. The bells of St. Louis Cathedral rang over the French Quarter, their tones soft yet insistent, a sound that had marked the passing of time in New Orleans for more than a century. As they echoed through the humid morning, another cry joined them, the thin, uncertain voice of a newborn child. The year was perhaps 1801, or perhaps earlier, in 1794. Records are uncertain, scattered like leaves in a storm. What is known is that a child was born to Marguerite d'Arcantel, a woman of African descent who had once been enslaved, and to Charles Laveau, sometimes remembered as the illegitimate son of a prominent white politician. Out of this union came a daughter, Marie, who would one day be known by every voice in the city. New Orleans in those years was unlike any other place in the young United States. Though the Louisiana Territory would soon be purchased by President Thomas Jefferson, its heart still beat with French and Spanish rhythms. Catholic saints gazed down from altars. French was spoken in the markets. Spanish records filled government ledgers. To the north and east, Anglo-American settlers were carving new lives from frontier lands. But here, at the bend of the Mississippi River, the city was Creole, a mingling of cultures, colors, and faiths. Marie was born into this crossroads. She was a free woman of color, and though that status granted her liberties unknown to many enslaved Africans, it also carried its own fragile uncertainty. The laws could change, the winds of politics could shift, and the delicate balance between privilege and peril could be broken in an instant. Her life would always rest on that edge. Her grandmother, Catherine, embodied that precarious journey. She'd been born into slavery decades earlier, when Louisiana was still a colony under French rule. Stolen from her family, transported across an ocean, she lived in a world where freedom seemed an impossible dream. And yet, through determination and fortune, she purchased her own release, and in time even built a modest home on St. Anne Street in the French Quarter. That cottage would become the heart of her family's story, a place where her granddaughter Marie would one day live, pray, and welcome both the powerful and the desperate into her parlor. The legacy of Catherine's struggle left a deep mark on the child Marie. Here was proof that bondage could be broken, that dignity could be preserved even in the face of cruelty. The stories of endurance and survival were whispered into her ears, shaping her sense of the world long before she could walk its streets. As the child grew, the world around her was shifting. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase transferred control from France to the United States, a vast and sudden change that doubled the size of the young republic. But for the people of New Orleans, life retained its unique character. French remained the common tongue, Catholic rites marked the seasons, and the Sunday gatherings in Congo Square carried the heartbeat of Africa into the New World. Marie would have heard those drums, deep, pulsing, alive. They called enslaved men and women to dance, to sing, to remember who they were beyond chains and fields. They called free people of color to join in rhythms that defied erasure. For a girl like Marie, Catholic prayers learned at dawn could mingle with the sound of ritual chants at dusk, and together they formed the dual heritage that would later define her path. Few records remain of her childhood, but we can imagine the narrow streets of the French Quarter where she walked, the smell of bread rising from corner bakeries, the sight of carriages rattling across cobblestones. We can imagine her kneeling at Mass in St. Louis Cathedral, her young eyes raised to the gilded altar. And we can imagine her listening, always listening, to the stories carried by the voices of women, whether in the marketplace or in her grandmother's kitchen. From her mother and grandmother, she learned resilience. From her city, she learned contradiction. From her faith, she learned ritual. All would come together in her later life. But for now, she was only a child, one among many in a city where past and future collided at every corner. The bells that rang at her birth continued to mark the days. They called people to worship, tolled for the dead, rang for celebrations. And for little Marie, they were the music of life itself, reminding her that time was always moving, carrying her toward destinies unknown. On certain evenings, as the air cooled and shadows stretched across the streets, she may have heard another sound, the beating of drums from Congo Square. Those rhythms carried memories older than the city itself, memories of homelands across the sea. They would become part of her, echoing inside her even when silence filled the night. As she drifted into sleep in her grandmother's cottage, the child could not yet know that one day those drums would rise with her name, and that the city itself would move to her rhythm. For now, she was only a girl, breathing the air of New Orleans, her life's story just beginning. And in the darkness outside, the drums continued, steady and unyielding, as if they knew what she would one day become. The drums of Congo Square did not fade quickly. They pulsed in the air like a second heartbeat, a rhythm that carried not only sound but memory. For the young Marie, those beats were echoes of stories she had yet to hear in full. Stories of ancestors who had crossed oceans unwillingly, who had lived and died under the weight of chains, and who had yet, through all of this, preserved fragments of identity that could never be broken. To understand Marie's life, one must first step back to those older generations, for their voices lingered in her blood and in the very soil of Louisiana. Her grandmother, Catherine, had been born into slavery in the middle of the 18th century, when Louisiana was still a possession of France. The colony had been carved out of swampland and riverbank, held together by ambition and by the forced labor of Africans brought from west and central regions of their continent. It was in 1743 that one of Marie's great-grandmothers, stolen from her homeland, arrived in New Orleans as human cargo. She was sold into a life of servitude, stripped of her language and kin, yet she carried within her the rhythms and faith that would endure long after her captors' names were forgotten. By the time Catherine grew to adulthood, the world around her had shifted. France had lost Louisiana to Spain in 1762 through the Treaty of Fontainebleau, weary of wars that drained its coffers. Under Spanish administration, laws concerning slavery were altered. Though still bound by cruelty, enslaved people were sometimes permitted to work for wages in their spare hours, slowly saving to purchase their own freedom. Sundays brought a rare reprieve when African drums could sound in public, and when bonds between the enslaved and the free were renewed through dance, trade, and song. Catherine's life followed this difficult but hopeful path. She labored, she endured, and finally, she purchased her freedom. Not content with survival alone, she built a small house on St. Anne Street, a modest cottage in the French Quarter. To some, it was no more than timber and plaster, but to her descendants, it became a sanctuary, a place of continuity in a world of upheaval. It was in those narrow rooms that her granddaughter Marie would one day grow, a girl absorbing the wisdom and resilience of generations past. Marguerite, Catherine's daughter and Marie's mother, was also born enslaved but freed by the time she reached young adulthood. At only 18, she gained the liberty that her mother had struggled decades to achieve. For women like her, freedom was both blessing and burden. It meant the chance to live without direct ownership, but also the constant reminder of how fragile that status could be. The laws of Louisiana shifted with every political tide, and the distinction between free people of color and those in bondage was always precarious. This was the world into which Marie was born, a city layered with contradictions. New Orleans was both European and African, Catholic and traditional, enslaved and free. The cathedral bells rang over a population where white Creoles owned plantations, free men of color operated successful shops, and enslaved laborers still toiled in fields and kitchens. Intermarriage between white men and women of African descent was common, but never officially sanctioned. Children of these unions often inherited both opportunity and stigma, inhabiting a liminal world between privilege and oppression. For Marie, the richness of these intertwined histories shaped her earliest sense of identity. Her bloodline carried France, Africa, and Native America within it, each thread woven by conquest, survival, and resilience. The customs of her family were equally complex. She was raised Catholic, attending Mass with regular devotion, yet the stories, remedies, and rituals of her grandmother connected her to older ways of knowing. Herbs brewed for healing, charms kept for protection, songs remembered from distant homelands. All of these seeped quietly into her childhood. The city itself amplified these influences. On Sundays, when enslaved people were allowed to gather in Congo Square, the square became a living archive of African traditions. Dancers stamped feet into the earth, bodies moved in circles, hands clapped in counter-rhythm to drums, and the air filled with melodies both mournful and jubilant. To outsiders, it seemed strange or frightening, a glimpse into something beyond European comprehension. To those who participated, it was a reconnection with ancestry, a resistance to forgetting. Young Marie would have been drawn to these gatherings not only for the music, but for the sense that something older than New Orleans was being carried into the present. The laws that allowed such practices were rooted in Spanish administration, which had, in some ways, been more tolerant than the French before them. Free people of color under Spanish law could own property, enter into recognized partnerships, and petition courts for justice, though always within limits defined by colonial hierarchies. When Louisiana was transferred back to France in 1800 and then sold to the United States in 1803, many of these arrangements were threatened. American authorities brought with them the rigid racial codes of the South, uneasy with the relative freedoms enjoyed by Creoles of color. Yet New Orleans resisted full conformity, clinging to its Creole identity and maintaining spaces where cultural blending could persist. Marie's early life must be seen against this backdrop. She was a child of contradictions, free yet vulnerable, Catholic yet shaped by African spirituality, French in tongue yet American by law. Each of these elements would later converge in her identity as Voodoo Queen. The path was not predetermined, but it was deeply prepared by the lives that had come before her. As she grew, she would have heard her grandmother's stories of struggle, of buying freedom coin by coin. She would have listened to her mother's voice, filled with both pride and caution, warning her of the dangers that lurked for free women of color. She would have watched the world of New Orleans swirl around her, vibrant and volatile, a city never still. The beating of Congo Square drums, the tolling of cathedral bells, the hum of marketplaces, the whispers of women in parlors, these were the sounds that filled her youth, and from them she learned that identity was not singular, but layered, that truth could be hidden beneath rumor, that survival demanded both faith and adaptability. It was in this environment, rich and uncertain, that the young girl took her first steps toward becoming a figure remembered long after her time. Yet for now, she remained only a child, listening, observing, absorbing. The city played out its dramas around her, and she was its silent witness. As dusk fell and the last of the dancers left Congo Square, the drums ceased, leaving only the echo of their rhythm in the night air. That silence, like a held breath, contained the promise of all that was yet to come. And in that silence, the child Marie dreamed, unaware that one day her own name would be spoken with the same reverence and awe as those ancestral drums. The silence after the drums was never empty. It lingered, like the hush of a cathedral when candles are still burning, like the breath held in prayer before a whispered Amen. Into that silence, the child Marie would wake in the mornings in her grandmother's modest cottage on St. Anne Street. The walls were plain, the floors uneven, yet the air carried the warmth of family, the resilience of women who had made a home out of hardship. In those rooms, she was not only clothed and fed, but instructed in the ways of living, in the habits that would shape her for years to come. Her grandmother, Catherine, now a free woman, was the foundation of that home. Though her life had begun in chains, she had carved a place for herself through determination and labor. That house on St. Anne Street was her achievement, and she guarded it with the dignity of one who had earned every stone, every beam. Marie absorbed the lessons of her grandmother's presence, that survival required patience, that respect had to be demanded through quiet endurance, that freedom was never guaranteed but always to be cherished. Her mother, Marguerite, was also there, guiding her daughter with care. Freed at a young age, Marguerite had lived at the edge of privilege and peril, and she carried the knowledge of both. She taught her child to be wary of the world, to carry herself with dignity, and to never forget the precarious line that separated a free woman of color from those who remained enslaved. Her advice was practical, protective, grounded in the realities of the city. From her earliest days, Marie was steeped in Catholic devotion. The bells of St. Louis Cathedral called her to Mass, and she attended with steady regularity. She would kneel in the pews, the scent of incense in the air, her eyes drawn to the altars adorned with gilded saints. The rhythms of Catholic ritual became second nature, the rosary beads slipping through her fingers, the hymns echoing in her memory, the sign of the cross traced across her chest. These practices offered stability, a framework of belief that would accompany her throughout her life. Yet alongside these formal devotions, she also learned the unspoken wisdom passed down through her family. Herbs were gathered and dried, teas brewed to soothe fevers, charms crafted to ward away misfortune. These were not seen as contradictions to Catholic faith, but as natural companions. For the people of New Orleans, belief was never singular. Saints could stand beside spirits, prayers could mingle with chants, and remedies could carry both the blessing of a priest and the memory of Africa. For young Marie, this blending of worlds was as natural as breathing. As she grew into adolescence, she learned a trade that would serve as her livelihood and her doorway into the lives of others: hairdressing. In the Creole households of New Orleans, hairdressing was not simply a matter of vanity, but a marker of status, identity, and pride. Styles were elaborate, requiring skill, patience, and artistry. Marie trained her hands to move with precision, her eyes to notice every detail. In time, she would become sought after for her ability to transform appearances, but even more for her quiet presence, her ability to listen. For a hairdresser was more than a stylist. She was a confidant, a keeper of secrets, a silent witness to the concerns of her clients. Women spoke freely while their hair was being arranged. They spoke of their marriages, their fears, their jealousies, their ambitions. They whispered about affairs, about debts, about rivals. A careful listener could gather a wealth of knowledge, and Marie learned to listen closely. Information was as valuable as any potion or charm, and she began, unknowingly, to weave herself into the hidden life of the city. Her youth was also marked by the contradictions of New Orleans itself. On one side, the grandeur of Creole society, balls, carriages, elegant gowns, and strict codes of respectability. On the other, the deep inequalities of slavery, the daily struggles of free people of color, the persistence of poverty. Marie walked between these worlds, familiar with both, belonging fully to neither. This duality gave her an unusual perspective. She could see the illusions of grandeur and the resilience of survival, the beauty and the suffering intertwined. The streets of her childhood were alive with sounds and scents, vendors calling out their wares in French, Spanish, and Creole, the smell of coffee, spices, and gumbo drifting through open windows, the distant sound of riverboats unloading goods at the Mississippi's edge. These details became part of her identity. To know Marie was to know New Orleans, and to know New Orleans was to understand the constant mingling of worlds. In those years, she may not have appeared extraordinary to those around her. She was one of many young women of color in the quarter, working, praying, helping her family. Yet even then, threads were being woven together. Her devotion to Catholic faith, her knowledge of traditional remedies, her skill as a hairdresser, her place within a family marked by resilience. All of these prepared her for the life that lay ahead, though neither she nor anyone else could have foreseen the figure she would one day become. At night, when the day's labors were done and the house grew quiet, Marie might have sat by candlelight, her hands occupied with combs or rosaries, her mind filled with fragments of conversations overheard, stories told by her grandmother, or the faint memory of drums across the city. The silence after the drums was still there, holding its promise. And in that silence, she was learning. She was preparing. She was listening to the voices of her city, voices that would one day call her queen. The candlelight flickered, shadows moving across the walls of the cottage. And as the flame trembled, it seemed to whisper of paths yet unseen, of choices yet unmade. The child had grown into a young woman. Soon she would step beyond the cottage walls into the wider city, carrying with her the strength of her family, the rituals of her faith, and the quiet knowledge that the world was larger than it seemed. And beyond those walls, the sound of bells rang again, calling her into the next chapter of her life. The bells of St. Louis Cathedral tolled through the streets of the French Quarter, steady and solemn, as if marking not only the hours of the day, but the passages of life itself. Their sound reached into the narrow rooms of the St. Anne Street cottage and into the heart of a young woman who was ready to take her place in the world beyond her family's home. Marie had grown from child to woman, and like so many of her generation, she turned to the cathedral not only for prayer, but for the rites of life. On the 4th of August in 1819, beneath the soaring arches of St. Louis Cathedral, Marie Laveau was married. Her husband was Jacques Paris, a man of free color who had fled the turmoil of the Haitian Revolution and found refuge in New Orleans, as thousands of others had. He worked as a carpenter, a trade that connected him to the fabric of the growing city, building its houses and shaping its streets. To their community, they must have seemed like a fitting pair, both free, both Creole, both children of a world shaped by upheaval and survival. The ceremony was solemn, blessed by priests and witnessed by the faithful. One can imagine the candles flickering on the altar, the Latin words echoing in the vaulted space, the mingling of incense and magnolia drifting through open doors. Marie, dressed in simple yet dignified attire, must have seemed a figure of grace, carrying the dignity of her mother and grandmother into a new chapter of her life. Yet like so much in her story, what followed is shadowed in mystery. Some records suggest that Marie and Jacques had children together. A baptismal record speaks of a daughter named Félicité in 1817, even before their official marriage. Another, in 1820, refers to a Marie Angélique, but the trail fades quickly, and later documents contain no mention of these daughters. Did they die in childhood, as so many children did in those years of disease and hardship? Or did the records themselves become lost, misplaced, or misremembered? There is no certainty, only the silence of the archives, a silence filled with unanswered questions. This pattern, the appearance of a fact, the disappearance of its traces, the persistence of rumor, would follow Marie throughout her life. It is as if she moved always on the border between what can be known and what can only be imagined. Even at the very beginning of her adult life, her story slips from the clarity of record into the haze of speculation. The marriage itself did not last long. By 1820, Jacques Paris had vanished from the records, leaving only a brief declaration on a baptismal entry that referred to Marie as his widow. Whether he died suddenly, whether he abandoned the family, or whether the truth lies somewhere in between, no one can say with confidence. What is clear is that by her early 20s, Marie was left alone, bearing the title of Widow Paris. The young widow carried this name into the city, a name that gave her a certain dignity and gravity. In Creole society, a widow was often accorded respect, her independence acknowledged, her maturity recognized. For Marie, the title gave her a new identity, one that separated her from the carefree youth of her earlier years. She was no longer simply Marie, the daughter of Marguerite and granddaughter of Catherine. She was Madame Paris, a woman marked by both union and loss. The loss of Jacques, whether through death or disappearance, left an imprint on her life. It was her first direct encounter with the fragility of human ties, the suddenness with which relationships could vanish into absence. Perhaps this prepared her for the resilience she would later show, the quiet strength she carried when others faltered, or perhaps it left her haunted by the uncertainty of departure, the knowledge that those we love can slip from our grasp without warning. Around this time, she began to weave her life more deeply into the city's rhythms. The St. Anne Street cottage remained her base, but her presence stretched beyond its walls. She took clients as a hairdresser, listening to their stories, building her reputation. She attended Mass faithfully, reinforcing her identity as a devout Catholic woman. And she carried with her the lessons of her mother and grandmother, who had shown that survival was always possible, even in the harshest of circumstances. New Orleans in the early 1820s was itself a city of transition. The Louisiana Purchase had brought American governance, but Creole traditions remained strong. French was still the dominant language in the streets, and Catholicism remained the heart of public life. Yet tensions simmered between the Creole community and the incoming Anglo-American settlers, who brought with them a stricter vision of race, one that clashed with the more fluid categories of Creole society. For free people of color, this tension meant constant uncertainty. Opportunities existed, but they could be stripped away at any moment. It was in this uncertain climate that Marie began her life as a widow. The world around her shifted with every political change, but she adapted, as her family had always adapted. The strength of Catherine, the caution of Marguerite, the dignity of her own marriage, All these guided her steps, and yet even as she found her footing, mysteries gathered around her. The missing daughters, the absent husband, the fragmentary records. All of these suggest a life that was never fully visible to outsiders. Perhaps she preferred it so. Perhaps she learned, even at this early stage, that power lies not only in what is known, but in what remains unknown. At night, in her cottage, she may have sat with a rosary in hand, praying for her lost husband or lost children, her voice quiet in the dim light. Outside, the city moved on. Carriages rattling, street vendors calling, the Mississippi carrying barges of goods to the Gulf. But inside, silence reigned, a silence filled with memory, grief, and resolve. The bells of St. Louis Cathedral continued to toll, marking the passage of days. They rang for her wedding, for baptisms, perhaps for funerals of children, perhaps for Jacques himself. They would ring again for every stage of her life. For now, they marked her widowhood, a new identity that would shape her path forward. The sound of those bells lingered in the air long after their chimes faded, just as the presence of Jacques lingered long after his name disappeared from the records. And in that lingering silence, Marie Paris, the widow, prepared to step into another chapter of her life. And somewhere in the quiet, where bells had just fallen silent, a faint sound arose again, the soft hiss of scales in the dark, as if a serpent moved unseen, foreshadowing the power she would one day wield. The faint hiss of scales in the dark was not a sound that startled, but one that whispered of unseen presence. In New Orleans, a city where Catholic prayers mingled with African chants and native stories, the serpent was not only a creature of the earth, but a messenger of power, an emblem of spirit. For the young widow Marie, moving through the years after Jacques Paris had vanished from her life, such unseen symbols seemed to gather around her, quiet hints of the path she was beginning to tread. Now known as the Widow Paris, she carried herself with a dignity beyond her years. The name gave her gravity, an air of solemnity that separated her from other young women. She was no longer merely a daughter or a bride. She was a woman marked by loss and endurance. In the tightly woven neighborhoods of the French Quarter, where every change of circumstance was noticed and whispered about, this new identity made her both a subject of curiosity and a figure of respect. She survived by her skill and by her presence. As a hairdresser, she was welcomed into the homes of women from many walks of life. She combed, braided, styled, and pinned their hair into elaborate creations that reflected not only fashion, but status. But more importantly, she listened. While her hands worked, her ears and eyes absorbed the subtleties of speech, gesture, and tone. She learned the concerns of her clients, their jealousies, their ambitions, their grievances. To them, she appeared attentive, discreet, sympathetic. To herself, she was building a quiet treasury of knowledge. In a city such as New Orleans, knowledge was a form of currency. Secrets could weigh more than gold. A whispered rumor, a hidden affair, a confession of debt, these could shift fortunes, ruin reputations, or preserve a fragile peace within the delicate hierarchy of Creole society. Marie understood that words, carefully kept and subtly used, could give her influence beyond the walls of any parlor. Yet her influence did not grow from worldly matters alone. Alongside her role as confidant, she deepened her knowledge of healing and ritual. From her grandmother and mother, she inherited practices rooted in Africa, carried across the ocean by ancestors who refused to let their spirits die. These included the use of herbs for remedies, charms for protection, and prayers that spoke not only to saints but to spirits. To some, these practices were dismissed as superstition. To others, they were life itself, a source of protection in a world filled with uncertainty. The Catholic rituals that shaped her daily life did not conflict with these traditions, but seemed to blend with them. She lit candles before statues of saints, prayed the rosary, attended Mass faithfully, yet she also honored the presence of spirits older than Catholicism, spirits whose voices could be heard in the rhythm of drums and the patterns of dreams. For Marie, there was no contradiction, only a weaving together of all that could bring strength, healing, and guidance. It was during these years that the city began to associate her with practices beyond the ordinary. Whispers grew of her involvement in rites that echoed the ceremonies of Congo Square, of her presence at gatherings where songs, dance, and spirit possession mingled with Christian symbols. Some said she trained under elder figures, perhaps Sanité Dédé, perhaps the mysterious Dr. John. Others believed her power came solely from her family's inheritance, the wisdom of women passed from one generation to another. No one knew for certain, and it may be that no single answer exists. What is known is that the widow Paris began to step more confidently into a role that combined the everyday with the mystical. She was still a hairdresser, still a parishioner at Mass, still a woman seen walking the narrow streets of the quarter. But she was also becoming something more. People sought her not only for beauty but for counsel, for remedies, for charms, for prayers that might shift the course of fortune. She did not announce herself as a queen or a leader. Rather, her reputation grew quietly, carried on whispers and confirmed by those who felt the power of her presence. Her widowhood, though marked by loss, gave her freedom. Without a husband, she was not bound by the expectations of domestic life. She could move more freely through the city, pursue her trade, expand her influence. This freedom was rare for women of color, even those who were free. She used it with care, always mindful of the dangers that lurked for anyone who stepped too far beyond the boundaries of convention. But within those limits, she found room to grow. And so, the young widow became a figure both ordinary and extraordinary. She lived in a modest cottage. She worked with her hands. She prayed in church like any other parishioner. Yet in her silence, in her attentiveness, in her willingness to bridge the worlds of Catholic devotion and African tradition, she was gathering threads that would one day weave into a mantle of authority. At night in her cottage on St. Anne Street, she may have tended to small altars adorned with both saints and candles, with herbs and charms, with rosaries and symbols not found in any catechism. Perhaps she prayed for her lost husband, for the children whose records had faded, for the strength to carry her family's legacy. Perhaps she prayed for guidance, listening for voices that spoke in dreams and in silence. Outside, the city moved restlessly. Ships arrived from distant ports, bringing goods and news, carrying with them migrants and exiles. The Mississippi rose and fell, flooding streets in seasons of rain. Disease appeared without warning, stealing lives by the hundreds. New laws were debated, restricting the freedoms of people of color, tightening the boundaries of a fragile existence. In such a world, faith and ritual were not luxuries, but necessities. They gave people a sense of control in a life where so much was uncontrollable. The hiss of scales in the darkness, the echo of drums, the tolling of bells, all these sounds surrounded the widow Paris. They reminded her that the world was filled with presences seen and unseen, powers that could not be denied. She did not yet claim to be their master. She did not yet call herself their queen. But already she was listening. Already she was learning. Already she was carrying herself as one who could bridge the visible and the invisible. The serpent's hiss faded into the stillness of night, a reminder of mysteries yet to come. And within that stillness, the widow Paris turned toward love once more, a love that would shape the next long chapter of her life, bringing her joy and grief, children and loss, partnership and debt. For soon, another man would enter her story, not as fleeting as Jacques Paris, but as a companion who would remain at her side for decades. His name was Louis Christophe Glapion, and through him, Marie's life would take on new depth, new sorrow, and new strength. Into the stillness of the widow Paris's life came the figure of Louis Christophe Glapion, a man of French descent, whose name belonged to one of the city's established families. He was of noble blood, though in New Orleans, nobility was never a shield against the complexities of race, class, and circumstance. To many, their union was unusual, even improper. Interracial marriages were forbidden, the law drawing rigid lines where the lives of people refused to obey. Yet love and companionship rarely bend to statutes. What began as affection between two individuals grew into a lifelong bond that would endure until Glapion's death. Marie and Christophe did not marry under the cathedral's arches, but in the eyes of their community they were husband and wife. Their partnership was spoken of with the same seriousness as any formal union. For Marie, the connection offered both security and risk. To live openly with a man of white descent was to defy convention. Yet Glapion did not hide their life together, and their home became a place where their shared existence unfolded with dignity. From this partnership came children, many children if the stories are to be believed. Some accounts speak of as many as 15, though the records of St. Louis Cathedral list fewer, and of these, some are marked only by the brief entries of baptisms or burials. Infant mortality was common, and sorrow shadowed their household more than once. The cradle and the coffin stood close in those years, and the joy of new life was often followed swiftly by grief. Even so, their family was a lively one. The cottage on St. Anne Street, modest yet enduring, became the heart of their household. Here children's voices rang through narrow rooms, laughter mingled with tears, and the daily labors of motherhood occupied Marie's time. Between caring for her family, tending to her clients, and deepening her spiritual practices, her days were full. Yet she moved with composure, as if guided by an inner balance that allowed her to carry both joy and loss without faltering. One child in particular would later take on a mysterious role in her story. Among the daughters of Marie and Christophe, some believe that one became known as Marie II, a younger woman who carried on her mother's name and perhaps her influence. The records do not resolve the question. Was there truly a second Marie, trained by her mother to continue her role? Or did the stories of Marie II arise from confusion, from the presence of daughters who resembled their mother closely, or from the blending of myth and fact that always surrounded the Laveau family? The uncertainty remains, a shadow stretching across generations. What is certain is that family life for Marie was inseparable from community life. She did not retreat into privacy, but remained a presence in New Orleans, known both for her trade and for her compassion. The struggles of her own household did not prevent her from extending aid to others. If a neighbor needed help, if a friend required counsel, if a stranger came to her door in desperation, she responded. Her own experience of loss and survival seemed to sharpen her empathy. Yet beneath this compassion lay a resilience born of necessity. To be a free woman of color in 19th century New Orleans was to live always in tension. Rights could be granted but also revoked. Opportunities could appear but vanish with a change in law. A family built in love could be dismissed by society as illegitimate. For Marie, every day required the balancing of contradictions. She was both partner and outsider, mother and mourner, Catholic devotee and practitioner of traditions labeled suspicious by authorities. She lived in the spaces between categories, and it was in those spaces that she found her strength. Christophe, though of noble French descent, also carried burdens. His family name gave him stature, yet his partnership with Marie placed him at odds with the rigid racial expectations of the time. Still, he remained at her side, through births and burials, through years of hardship and fleeting prosperity. Their love, though not sanctified by law, endured longer than most sanctioned unions. In this constancy, Marie found not only companionship but affirmation. Her life, so often shadowed by rumor and doubt, was grounded by a relationship that weathered decades. The children, those who survived beyond infancy, grew into adulthood with their mother's presence shaping them. Some lived quietly, blending into the fabric of the city. Others faded from view, their names lost to time, but each was part of Marie's story, each a thread in the tapestry of her life. And always the possibility of a second Marie, Marie II, lingers, a reminder of how difficult it is to separate truth from legend in the life of the Voodoo Queen. In the evenings, when the household quieted and children drifted to sleep, Marie and Christophe may have sat together in silence, the flicker of lamplight casting shadows across the room. Their lives were marked by simplicity, by debt, by loss, but also by the quiet contentment of companionship. The city outside might be restless, filled with noise and conflict, but within their walls there was the peace of endurance. Yet even within this peace, the seeds of transformation were being sown. The woman who was once the widow Paris, now the companion of Christophe Glapion, was beginning to take on a larger role in the imagination of New Orleans. Her skills as a hairdresser, her compassion for the needy, her quiet authority, and her growing reputation as a woman of spiritual power. All these elements were converging. She was no longer only a figure within her family or her neighborhood. She was becoming a presence recognized across the city. The hiss of unseen scales, the tolling of cathedral bells, the murmur of secrets in parlors. All these sounds seemed to gather around her, weaving a mantle of mystery and authority. She did not yet wear the crown of the Voodoo Queen, but already the whispers had begun. And as the children slept, their mother awake in thought, one sound remained constant, the click of scissors, the snip of hair falling to the floor, the quiet rhythm of her hands working late into the night. For it was in this trade, more than any other, that she would shape not only appearances, but reputations, destinies, and the hidden life of New Orleans. The scissors closed with a metallic click, sharp and final, echoing into the night air. That sound would follow her into the next chapter, when the chair of the hairdresser became a throne of secrets, and when the woman who listened learned how to turn knowledge into power. The metallic click of the scissors lingered in the room long after the final strands of hair had fallen to the floor. That sound, sharp yet rhythmic, marked the passage of hours in the life of Marie Laveau. With each snip, she shaped not only the appearance of her clients, but also her own quiet ascent into the hidden heart of New Orleans society. In the simple chair of a hairdresser, she found a vantage point more powerful than any pulpit or office. Her skill with hair was undeniable. She transformed tresses into elaborate arrangements, creating styles that reflected both tradition and fashion. The women of the French Quarter, whether of Creole lineage or the white elite, sought her hands because they trusted her artistry. But artistry alone did not secure her place. What made Marie extraordinary was her presence, the calm assurance with which she listened, the discretion with which she guarded confidences, and the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from her very being. In the intimacy of the hairdresser's chair, masks often slipped. Women who in public carried themselves with dignity and restraint spoke freely in private, their words flowing as Marie's fingers worked through their hair. They complained of unfaithful husbands, fretted over debts, whispered of affairs, shared fears about illness or rivals. Their secrets poured out in fragments, unguarded and unmeasured, while Marie listened silently. She did not pry, nor did she betray their trust. She absorbed, she remembered, she understood. Knowledge, she knew, was more valuable than gold. A misplaced word could destroy a reputation, while a carefully kept secret could purchase loyalty. By listening, she became not only a stylist but a confidant, someone whose silence was more powerful than speech. And though she rarely revealed what she knew, her reputation grew. People began to believe that Marie could see into lives, that she possessed insight beyond the ordinary. To some, this was a gift of intuition. To others, it was evidence of something mystical, a power that went beyond human skill. The boundaries between perception and divination blurred. If she knew of a family quarrel before it became public, was it because she had overheard it from a client, or because spirits had whispered it to her? If she foresaw a marriage collapsing, was it observation or prophecy? Those who sought her aid did not ask too closely. They wanted results, not explanations. Her clients included women of status and influence, whose husbands were merchants, lawyers, judges, and officials. Through their confessions, Marie came to understand the hidden currents of power in New Orleans. She learned who held debts, who carried grudges, who feared scandal. She gathered this knowledge quietly, storing it like a river gathers tributaries, until she became a reservoir of the city's secrets. In time, her reputation spread beyond the parlors of her clients. People spoke of her as someone who knew things no one else could know. Whispers claimed she had the gift of sight, the ability to uncover truths hidden from others. Some said she could read thoughts, others that she communed with spirits. The truth may have been simpler, her attentiveness, her memory, her insight, but perception shaped reality, and soon Marie was regarded as more than a hairdresser. She was becoming a woman of influence. Still, she remained grounded in her daily life. She attended Mass regularly, kneeling before the altar with the same devotion as always. She tended to her family, to her children, to her partner, Christophe Glapion. She walked the streets of the quarter, modestly dressed, never ostentatious. To outward appearances, she was an ordinary woman. Yet beneath this simplicity lay an aura of authority that others sensed even if they could not name it. The city itself seemed to reinforce her growing role. New Orleans was a place of mingled cultures and shifting powers, where the line between official authority and hidden influence was often thin. The police hesitated to confront her, whether out of respect, fear, or belief in her powers. The poor sought her counsel as readily as the wealthy sought her artistry. And slowly, the idea of Marie as a figure of power began to take hold. In her modest cottage on St. Anne Street, she continued to welcome visitors. Some came for hairdressing, others for remedies, others for charms. She listened, she advised, she provided what she could. For some, it was comfort, for others, protection. For others still, the hope of bending fate in their favor. Each left with the sense that they had been heard, that their troubles had been understood. And as her reputation grew, so too did the myths around her. Stories spread that she could command spirits, that she knew the thoughts of men before they spoke, that she could alter fortunes with a glance. These tales, though exaggerated, carried truth in another form. They reflected the power she held over imagination, the influence she exerted without ever needing to claim it. The scissors, clicking in the dim light of her cottage, became symbols of this quiet authority. Each cut, each strand of hair falling to the floor was part of a larger tapestry being woven. She was shaping more than appearances. She was shaping perception itself, and with it, the destiny of her name. Late at night, when the day's work was done and the cottage grew quiet, Marie might have paused to sweep the hair from the floor. In that simple act lay a metaphor for her life, gathering fragments, discarding what was unnecessary, keeping the essential. She swept not only hair but secrets, stories, and sorrows. She carried them silently, and in doing so, became more than any title could describe. The sound of the broom brushing the floor faded into silence. Yet within that silence, another sound rose, a distant rhythm, faint but insistent, carried from the gatherings at Congo Square and from the shores of Bayou St. John. It was the rhythm of drums, the heartbeat of rituals that would soon call her more fully into the role that legend would remember, not only confidant, not only healer, not only hairdresser, but the queen of voodoo. The faint rhythm that drifted through the night grew stronger, gathering force until it filled the very air of the city. The drums of Congo Square called out once more, steady and unyielding, a heartbeat that reminded all who heard them that the past was not gone, but alive in the present. For Marie Laveau, those rhythms were more than sound. They were memory, inheritance, and invitation. On Sundays, when laws permitted the enslaved to gather, Congo Square transformed. The open ground near the city's ramparts became a stage for survival and celebration. There, Africans from different nations, speaking different tongues, danced and sang together, their movements carrying echoes of homelands across the ocean. Circles formed, feet stamped, arms lifted, bodies swayed in unison. Drums of every size marked the rhythm, rattles shook, voices rose in call and response. To outsiders, it seemed chaotic, perhaps even dangerous. To participants, it was sacred, a reclaiming of identity that no master could erase. Marie, whether as a child at her mother's side or later as a young woman, would have witnessed these gatherings. The spectacle of color, sound, and motion left an indelible mark on her. But more than the spectacle, it was the meaning that mattered. In Congo Square, the boundaries of enslavement were momentarily loosened. Spirit moved freely, ancestors were remembered, and community was affirmed. For a girl who grew up Catholic and Creole, these gatherings showed that faith could be expressed with both reverence and fire, with ritual and improvisation. As she grew older, her presence extended beyond Congo Square. On the eve of St. John, the 24th of June, she and others made their way to the waters of Bayou St. John. By torchlight, rituals unfolded that mingled Catholic celebration with African tradition. Fires blazed, songs rose into the humid night, and offerings were cast upon the water. The bayou reflected not only the flames, but the spirit of those who gathered, their voices united in seeking blessing, protection, and power. It was here, among the mingling of fire and water, that Marie's reputation deepened. She was not the only woman present, nor the only leader. Names such as Sanité Dédé and Marie Salopé are remembered as elder priestesses who may have guided her steps. The mysterious figure known as Dr. John, sometimes remembered as a conjurer of great renown, may also have influenced her practices. But while others shone briefly, Marie endured. Her presence at these ceremonies became legendary, her leadership undeniable, her aura unmistakable. Part of her authority came from her ability to weave together traditions. She never abandoned her Catholic devotion. She continued to attend Mass, to pray the Rosary, to keep images of saints in her home. But she also honored spirits with African roots, invoked the serpent as symbol of divine presence, and led ceremonies that drew from both worlds. To some, this seemed contradictory. To her and to many Creoles of New Orleans, it was harmony. The saints could stand beside the spirits. The cross could rise above the circle. The sacred was wide enough to hold all traditions. In time, her rituals became known throughout the city. On St. John's Eve, people gathered not only for celebration, but to witness Marie. She was said to lead dances with a serpent named Le Grand Zombie, a snake embodying one of the great spirits of voodoo. When she lifted the serpent high, when she danced with it coiled around her arms, the crowd saw not only a woman, but a priestess, a queen, a figure who bridged the human and the divine. Accounts from the period describe these gatherings with awe, sometimes with fear. Outsiders, unfamiliar with the meaning, saw only strangeness: drums, fire, serpents, chants. They called it sorcery, witchcraft, even devil worship. But those who knew, those who participated, understood differently. The rituals were not about darkness, but about life, healing, and protection. They were moments when the community found strength together, when fears were laid down, when hope was renewed. For Marie, these ceremonies expanded her role. She was no longer simply the widow Paris, the hairdresser of secrets. She was becoming the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, though perhaps she never called herself by that title. The people gave it to her, recognizing in her the authority to lead, the presence to inspire, the wisdom to guide. Her prominence was not without risk. The city's authorities watched voodoo with suspicion, fearing its gatherings as potential sparks of rebellion. Police raids sometimes disrupted ceremonies, seizing drums, scattering dancers. Yet they often hesitated to confront Marie herself. Her reputation was such that even officers of the law tread carefully in her presence, unsure whether they faced a woman of flesh and blood or someone backed by unseen forces. In this tension, her power grew. Fear and reverence mingled, strengthening the aura around her. Those who sought her aid did so with respect, whether they were enslaved laborers desperate for protection or wealthy matrons longing for influence. She bridged divides, offering her counsel to all who came. Her home on St. Anne Street became as much a temple as a cottage, a place where rituals could be performed, charms prepared, remedies dispensed. At the heart of her practice was not domination, but service. She healed the sick with herbs, provided amulets for safety, prayed for those in despair. She offered exorcisms for the afflicted, blessings for the hopeful, guidance for the lost. Each act reinforced her reputation, each ritual confirmed her authority, and always her presence, calm, commanding, compassionate, held the trust of those who followed her. On nights when the ceremonies ended, when fires died down and torches smoldered to ash, Marie would walk the streets with the composure of a queen returning to her court. People watched her pass, whispering her name, convinced that the spirits walked with her. To some, she was a woman to be feared, to others a saint to be revered. To all, she was unforgettable. And so, the drums of Congo Square and the waters of Bayou St. John became not only backdrops, but stages upon which her identity was forged. They gave her the space to embody the role she would carry for decades. Priestess, healer, queen. The circle of candles flickered in the night, their flames trembling in the breeze. As the last of them burned low, the city held its breath, knowing that something had changed. The woman who had once been a quiet widow was now a figure of legend in the making. And from the dying light of those candles came whispers, rumors, and fears that spread through the city, carried from mouth to mouth until they reached even the ears of the police. For the next chapter of her life would not only be marked by reverence, but also by confrontation with suspicion, hostility, and myth. The candles sputtered in the night air, their flames bending low before fading into darkness. Yet as their light vanished, their smoke lingered, curling upward in faint trails that seemed to carry whispers into the sky. Those whispers did not stay confined to the bayou or the quiet rooms of her cottage. They spread through the streets of New Orleans, passed in marketplaces, repeated in parlors, murmured along the riverfront. They carried Marie Laveau's name, stretching her reputation until it reached even those who had never seen her face. Some whispers spoke with reverence. They told of her healing hands, her remedies that soothed fever when doctors failed, her prayers that comforted the dying. They said she had posted bonds for free women of color, accused of crimes, ensuring their freedom until trial. They remembered her visiting prisoners, carrying food and words of hope into the shadows of the jail. These stories painted her as a woman of compassion, a protector of the vulnerable, a saintly figure in a city where suffering was common. Other whispers carried fear. They told of spells that brought ruin to those who crossed her, of curses laid upon enemies, of rituals where shadows danced with firelight and serpents slithered in circles. They said she could bend fate itself, command spirits to do her bidding, uncover secrets hidden in the human heart. These tales painted her not as saint, but as sorceress, a woman who wielded dark power in ways no priest could sanction. Rumor rarely distinguishes truth from invention. It embellishes, distorts, magnifies. And yet, the power of rumor is real, shaping how people act, how they speak, how they treat the one at its center. For Marie, rumor became both shield and weapon. It protected her from interference, for even the police hesitated to confront a woman thought capable of commanding invisible forces. But it also marked her as dangerous, suspect, a figure always one step away from persecution. In the decades of her life, New Orleans newspapers occasionally turned their attention to her. Some reported on her ceremonies, describing them in tones of scandal or disbelief. Writers painted her as an exotic curiosity, a relic of Africa hidden in the heart of America. Others condemned her outright, calling her a fraud, a charlatan, even a witch. John Kendall, an early 20th century journalist, would later describe carriages arriving after dark at her cottage, ladies of high society slipping inside to purchase charms. He dismissed her as an errant fraud, yet in the same breath admitted that money poured into her lap until the last day of her evil life. His words, filled with prejudice, tell less about her than about the fears and biases of the world around her. But while outsiders judged from afar, those who lived alongside her told a different story. Neighbors remembered her home filled with images of saints, her regular attendance at Mass, her constant readiness to help those in need. For them, she was not a witch or a fraud, but a woman whose faith and generosity defined her. They saw her walking the streets with calm assurance, greeting others with courtesy, embodying dignity in a society that often denied it to women of color. The tension between these two images, saint and sorceress, healer and witch, was never resolved. It was this very tension that gave her aura its power. People did not need certainty, they needed belief. And belief, whether rooted in admiration or fear, kept her name alive. Even the authorities were not immune. Police officers tasked with enforcing laws against gatherings or rituals often hesitated when Marie was involved. Some believed confronting her would invite misfortune. Others may have respected her community standing too much to interfere. Whatever the reasons, the effect was the same. She moved through the city with an authority that seemed untouchable, as if protected not only by law but by something greater, something unseen. This was not power seized through violence or proclamation. It was power built quietly, through listening, through serving, through embodying a role that others came to believe in. Marie did not crown herself Queen of Voodoo. The city crowned her, not with ceremony but with whispers, not with pageantry but with recognition. And once that crown was placed upon her, it could not easily be removed. Her home on St. Anne Street became a place of pilgrimage. Carriages may well have arrived under cover of night, carrying women dressed in silks who sought remedies for illnesses, charms for lovers, or protection against rivals. Equally, men of influence may have come discreetly, seeking guidance in matters they dared not speak of openly. And alongside them, the poor came with their needs as well, hoping for relief, counsel, or a simple word of comfort. All were received, for Marie's door was open to many. The power she held was not only spiritual, but social. By weaving together the lives of rich and poor, black and white, Catholic and African, she embodied the contradictions of New Orleans itself. Her authority was born not from separation, but from inclusion. She stood at the crossroads of cultures and claimed them all as her inheritance. And yet, even as she gathered influence, the dangers around her did not vanish. White supremacist sentiment simmered. suspicious of any strength found among people of color. Outsiders mocked the dances and ceremonies, calling them orgies or savageries. Authorities worried that such gatherings masked rebellion. The Civil War looming on the horizon would sharpen these hostilities further. For now, though, Marie walked a delicate line, her authority strong but always shadowed by risk. At night, after visitors had left and the streets had grown still, Marie may have sat in her cottage, surrounded by candles whose wax melted into pools of silence. Perhaps she prayed for the strength to carry the burdens of others. Perhaps she sought guidance from saints and spirits alike. In the quiet, her reputation grew without her lifting a hand, carried by whispers she did not control yet could not ignore. The footsteps of prisoners she had once comforted, the sighs of women she had once counseled, the whispers of officials who feared her. All these sounds seemed to echo through the darkness, weaving into the night like threads of a single cloth. And as the night deepened, one sound lingered most of all, the heavy steps echoing down a prison corridor, where Marie's presence brought comfort to those who waited behind bars. Those footsteps, firm and sorrowful, carried us from the world of rumor into the world of compassion, where her deeds spoke more clearly than any gossip ever could. The echo of footsteps down the prison corridor carried the weight of chains and sorrow, yet alongside that heaviness came the quieter sound of compassion. Marie's voice, soft in prayer, her hands carrying food or medicine to men and women who had little else to hold on to. From those corridors of despair, her presence moved outward into the wider city, where illness and death pressed not behind iron bars, but in every street and household. New Orleans was no stranger to disease, and in those years, epidemics fell upon the city with merciless regularity. Yellow fever, in particular, haunted the city like an uninvited spirit. It arrived with the heat of summer, spreading swiftly, carried by mosquitoes that no one yet understood. At its peak, whole families fell ill, streets grew silent except for the rumble of carts carrying the sick to hospitals and the dead to cemeteries. Bells tolled constantly, announcing losses too numerous to count. Fear settled into the very air, for the fever spared neither rich nor poor. In such times, doctors offered little hope. Their remedies, bleeding, purging, the use of harsh emetics, often weakened patients more than the fever itself. Families watched helplessly as loved ones declined despite the efforts of trained physicians. Yet amid this despair, the people of New Orleans turned to women like Marie, whose knowledge came not from books but from tradition, from memory, from the wisdom of ancestors. Marie's remedies were simple but effective. Herbal teas to cool the body, poultices to soothe pain, baths to refresh the fevered skin, prayers to calm the spirit. She offered not only treatment, but presence, staying at the bedside when others were too afraid. Her reputation as a healer grew in these epidemics, not through grand gestures, but through countless small acts of care. Neighbors remembered her moving from house to house, carrying herbs, whispering prayers, providing comfort. In a time when fear drove many away, she drew closer. Her work did not end at the threshold of any single household. She was known to collaborate with parish priests, combining her remedies with their sacraments, uniting body and soul in the struggle against illness. To the people she served, there was no contradiction in this union. Catholic prayers and Creole remedies worked together, just as they had for generations. Marie embodied this union, moving easily between altar and hearth, between church and cottage. The epidemics revealed not only her skill, but her courage. In a city where yellow fever could strike anyone without warning, to nurse the sick was to risk one's own life. Yet she did not turn away. For every act of charity, she put herself in danger, and still she continued. This willingness to stand with the suffering, even at personal risk, deepened the reverence with which many regarded her. At the same time, her role as healer strengthened the myths that surrounded her. To those who experienced recovery under her care, it seemed proof of her power. When a child survived after receiving her teas, or when a fever broke after her visit, families credited not only her remedies, but her spiritual authority. Whispers spread that she could command life and death, that spirits obeyed her will, that the fever itself recoiled from her presence. The truth was both simpler and more profound. She healed through knowledge, compassion, and faith, not by conjuring forces of darkness, but by embodying the best of human care. Yet the people of New Orleans, living in fear and hope, clothed her actions in the garments of legend. Thus the healer became more firmly established as the Queen. In the wider city, her reputation grew with every epidemic. Those who once dismissed her as a fraud now hesitated. Even the skeptical could not ignore the testimonies of those she helped. In times of plague, belief becomes necessity, and many turn to her not only for remedies, but for the hope she represented. Her cottage on St. Anne Street became a place where the sick and their families sought refuge. The walls of that modest home absorbed the prayers of the desperate, the sighs of the fevered, the tears of the grieving. Images of saints watched over them, candles flickered in corners, herbs dried in bundles overhead. It was both home and sanctuary, both clinic and chapel. Through it all, Marie carried herself with humility. She did not proclaim herself a savior or advertise her abilities. She simply continued her work, guided by the same devotion that led her to post bonds for women accused of crimes or to comfort prisoners awaiting trial. Her strength lay in constancy, in her refusal to turn away from those in need. And so, during those summers when yellow fever ravaged New Orleans, the echo of footsteps in prison corridors was joined by other sounds: the rattle of carriage wheels carrying the sick, the muffled cries of families in mourning, the steady hum of prayers whispered at bedsides. Amid these sounds, Marie's voice rose quietly, soothing, steady, unafraid. When the fever passed, leaving graves filled and families broken, her reputation remained. She was remembered not only as the Voodoo Queen, but as a nurse, a healer, a woman who walked into danger with faith as her shield. Even those who feared her rituals could not deny her compassion. Even those who mocked her practices admitted her courage. In the silence after each epidemic, as the city tried to gather itself again, people looked to her as a symbol of resilience. She had stood with them in the worst of times, and for that, her name was spoken with gratitude as well as awe. The rattle of carriage wheels carrying the sick faded as the city recovered once more. Yet in their place came another sound, heavier and more ominous. The drums of war in the distance, the rumble of conflict that would soon engulf the nation. For as the Civil War approached, New Orleans would face not only fever, but the deeper divisions of race, power, and fear. And in that turbulent era, Marie's role would take on new complexity, as both her faith and her authority were tested. The rattle of carriage wheels carrying the fevered and dying grew quiet as the epidemic waned. But in the silence that followed, another sound began to rise. Deeper, heavier, more unrelenting. It was the sound of drums, not from Congo Square this time, but from the march of soldiers, from the distant thunder of cannon fire, from the restless preparation of a nation splitting apart. The Civil War was approaching, and with it came storms more enduring than fever, storms born of ideology, of race, of power, and of fear. In New Orleans, the tension could be felt long before the first shots were fired. The city was unlike any other in the South, its Creole heritage, Catholic faith, and mixture of cultures setting it apart from the Anglo-American world that was tightening its grip. Here, free people of color had lived with a measure of dignity, building businesses, purchasing property, maintaining families across lines that outsiders struggled to understand. But as the nation fractured, suspicion grew heavier, laws harsher, the fragile freedoms of people like Marie increasingly threatened. The gatherings at Congo Square, once tolerated under Spanish law and grudgingly accepted under French and American rule, became suspect. Authorities feared that such assemblies could spark rebellion, that drums and dances concealed plots against white power. Ceremonies were watched, sometimes raided, their instruments seized, their leaders harassed. Public displays of voodoo grew more difficult, driven further into secrecy. Yet secrecy often amplifies mystery, and for Marie, this shift only deepened the aura that already surrounded her. At the same time, the growing presence of white supremacist attitudes cast voodoo itself in darker light. Where once it had been misunderstood but tolerated as a curious Creole practice, it was now openly mocked and condemned. Outsiders called it savage, unholy, even diabolical. They reduced sacred dances to orgies, dismissed rituals of healing as witchcraft, and used these caricatures as justification for greater control. The faith of her ancestors, the practices that blended Catholic and African traditions, were painted in the language of derision. Marie lived at the heart of this shifting world. To her neighbors and followers, she remained a figure of constancy, a woman whose prayers and remedies brought comfort when nothing else could. To the authorities, she was a suspicious presence, someone whose influence reached too widely, someone who could not be ignored but was too deeply respected to be easily suppressed. To those who sought scandal, she was a symbol of all they feared, a woman of color with authority, moving freely in a city where racial lines were supposed to harden, not blur. The Civil War reached New Orleans in 1862, when Union forces captured the city early in the conflict. Unlike many Southern towns, New Orleans did not endure long years of battle, but the occupation brought its own upheavals. Confederate supporters bristled under Union control. Enslaved people sought freedom in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation. The balance of power shifted, unsettled, and fragile. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, fear and rumor grew even louder, and Marie's presence was felt as both reassurance and provocation. For the poor and the vulnerable, she remained a source of aid. Her cottage continued to welcome those in need of counsel or protection. She prayed with prisoners, comforted families, provided remedies for illness. In a city where institutions faltered and loyalties divided, her constancy mattered. She represented survival, a reminder that community could endure even when politics tore it apart. But for those in power, her authority was troubling. It was one thing for a woman of color to serve as hairdresser, nurse, or parishioner, or it was another for her to be revered as a queen, to command respect across lines of class and race, to carry an influence that rivaled that of officials or priests. Her role as the Voodoo Queen challenged the very hierarchies the war sought to define. Yet despite suspicion and hostility, she endured. Her strength lay not in confrontation, but in resilience. She did not lead armies or write proclamations. She continued her work quietly, attending Mass, preparing remedies, performing rituals when possible, always present, always steadfast. In the turbulence of war, she remained herself, and that constancy became its own form of resistance. As the war dragged on, the city was marked by hunger, disease, and unrest. The sound of drums was replaced by the silence of shortages, the quiet despair of families broken by conflict. Marie's presence during these years is less recorded, for legends do not always mark the daily work of survival. But the silence itself is telling. Even when ceremonies were prohibited, even when gatherings were watched, she remained a figure in the city's imagination, a queen whose crown could not be stripped by decree. After the war, the nation entered Reconstruction, and with it came both hope and hostility. The end of slavery promised new beginnings, yet the backlash of white supremacy grew fiercer. Voodoo, already mocked, was further degraded, described in popular accounts as foolish or dangerous, evidence of African ignorance. Dances were caricatured on stage, stripped of meaning, turned into entertainment for outsiders. What was sacred to Marie and her followers was ridiculed by those who sought to erase its dignity. For her, these years must have been painful. To see the practices of her ancestors reduced to mockery, to hear the rituals of healing dismissed as superstition, to feel the weight of prejudice pressing heavier, these were new burdens. Yet she bore them with the same patience she had always shown. She continued her devotion to Mass, continued her charity, continued her work, even as the world around her tried to diminish what she represented. The broken drum, lying silent after ceremonies were suppressed, became a symbol of these years. It lay not destroyed, but waiting, its skin taut, its voice ready to rise again when the time came. And just as the drum awaited revival, so too did Marie's presence endure, steady even in silence, powerful even when unseen. Her story during the Civil War and Reconstruction is not one of triumph in battle or victory in politics. It is the story of survival, of dignity maintained in the face of scorn, of quiet endurance when louder voices sought to drown her out. That, perhaps, was her greatest strength, the ability to remain unchanged at her core while the world shifted violently around her. The silent drum lingered as a reminder, a promise, and in that silence, a new sound began to stir. The rustle of followers who refused to let tradition die, the hiss of fire rekindled, the voice of rituals finding new life. For though war and prejudice had sought to suppress her world, the spirit of voodoo endured, rising again in circles of song and dance where Marie's name was spoken with reverence. The broken drum lay silent for a time, its voice stilled by fear and suppression. Yet silence is never the end. A drum waits. Its skin tightens in the air. Its wood breathes with memory. Its silence itself becomes anticipation. And then, one night, a hand lifted it again. A palm struck it once more, and the rhythm returned. Slow at first, then stronger until the sound moved through the streets, calling the people back to themselves. So it was with the rituals of New Orleans. Though laws had restricted public gatherings and mockery had tried to diminish their meaning, the people did not forget. Behind closed doors, in quiet courtyards, along the waters of Bayou St. John, the songs rose again. Candles burned, offerings were laid, prayers were whispered in both French and Creole. And always Marie's presence was near. She had become not just a participant, but the heart of these ceremonies, the figure around whom they gathered, the one whose authority no decree could erase. Central to her legend was the serpent, Le Grand Zombie. In African tradition, the serpent was not a symbol of evil, but of divine wisdom, fertility, and the cycle of life. To lift the serpent in ritual was to honor the spirit it embodied, to acknowledge its power as mediator between worlds. Marie was said to dance with Le Grand Zombie coiled around her arms, its scales glistening in torchlight, its body moving with hers, as if spirit and priestess were joined. To those who watched, it was more than spectacle. It was revelation, a vision of power alive in the body of a woman whom they already revered as queen. The image of her with the serpent burned into the city's imagination. It became proof for some that she communed with spirits, evidence for others that she ruled the invisible as well as the visible. Outsiders recoiled, their fears magnified by prejudice, but her followers saw only strength, only the affirmation that their faith was alive and sanctified through her. Alongside the serpent came the charms and tokens she provided, known as gris-gris. These small packets, filled with herbs, stones, or personal items, were believed to protect, to heal, to attract fortune, or to ward off harm. The origins of gris-gris lay in West Africa, where such amulets carried spiritual force. In New Orleans, under Marie's guidance, they became not only sacred tools but also sources of income. She prepared them with care, each tailored to the need of the person who sought her help. To some, it was superstition. To those who carried them, it was hope made tangible. Her cottage on St. Anne Street became both shop and shrine. Visitors came at all hours, slipping in quietly to purchase charms, to seek remedies, to ask for prayers. They left with tokens in their pockets, faith in their hearts, and stories on their tongues. Each story added to her reputation. Each testimony reinforced her role. Slowly, steadily, she became more than a leader of ceremonies. She became the undisputed Queen of Voodoo, a title given not by proclamation, but by the people themselves. Her abilities were described in many ways. Some said she could cast spells, others that she performed exorcisms, others still that she acted as oracle, foretelling what was hidden. Much of this was exaggeration, fueled by fear or awe. Yet at the core was something true. Her deep understanding of human nature, her compassion for suffering, her skill in blending ritual with faith. Whether she healed through herbs, through prayer, or through the strength she gave others by her presence, the result was the same. Lives were changed, hope was restored, and her authority grew. Not all regarded her kindly. Some accused her of fraud, of exploiting belief for profit. Others painted her as sinister, aligned with the devil, dangerous to decent society. These accusations said less about her than about the prejudices of her time. In a world where African traditions were dismissed as backward and women of color were denied respect, her prominence itself was an act of defiance. By standing in authority, she contradicted every expectation placed upon her. That contradiction frightened those who clung to hierarchy, even as it inspired those who sought freedom. The police, for all their suspicion, often held back. Stories circulated that they feared confronting her directly, believing misfortune would fall upon them if they did. Whether this fear was born of superstition or of respect for her wide influence, it gave her a freedom rare in her community. She moved with the confidence of one untouchable, not by law, but by legend. On nights when ceremonies reached their height, the city seemed to hold its breath. The air pulsed with rhythm, the flames flickered in time with song, the serpent swayed with her body. Those who participated left, transformed, certain they had touched the divine. Those who only heard the distant drums whispered of sorcery, scandal, or danger. And through it all, Marie stood at the center, neither confirming nor denying the tales, allowing her mystery to grow. Her reign as Queen of Voodoo was not marked by coronation or crown, but by presence. She did not need to proclaim her title. It lived in the way people spoke her name, in the way they sought her aid, in the way they lowered their voices when they passed her cottage at night. Her authority was not written in law but inscribed in belief, and belief, once rooted, was stronger than any decree. In her modest home, the queenly aura did not diminish. The same woman who danced with a serpent and led ceremonies by torchlight also knelt in prayer before her household altar, surrounded by images of saints. She swept her floors, prepared her herbs, listened to the troubles of neighbors. Her life was at once ordinary and extraordinary, grounded in daily tasks yet soaring into legend. The hiss of water along Bayou St. John accompanied these nights, as if the bayou itself carried the memory of chants and offerings. Its surface reflected both fire and moonlight, bearing witness to rituals that outsiders condemned but participants cherished. And in that reflection, Marie's image shimmered, a woman both of the earth and beyond it, both neighbor and queen. The hiss of water lingered after the fires burned low. It carried into the quiet hours before dawn, when torches were extinguished and voices fell silent. And from that hiss, the story turns once more inward to the sorrows that returned to her home, when love endured but death entered again, leaving Marie with burdens of debt and grief that even her power could not ease. The hiss of water along Bayou St. John lingered as the torches dimmed and the songs fell silent. It was the sound of endurance, of life continuing after fire had burned low. Yet endurance is never without cost. Even queens must face the sorrows that come to every home. And for Marie, those sorrows returned in the middle years of her life, heavy and unrelenting. In 1855, her partner of nearly 3 decades, Louis Christophe Glapion, died. Their union had been one of companionship, love, and defiance. Though never sanctified by law or church, it had carried the weight of permanence, lasting far longer than most marriages around them. Together they had raised children, some lost in infancy, others carried into adulthood. Together they had shared a life in the St. Anne Street cottage, its rooms echoing with laughter, prayer, and the quiet comfort of routine. His death left Marie not only with grief, but with burdens he could no longer carry. Christophe had left behind debts, significant enough to weigh heavily on her already modest means. For a woman who had devoted so much of her life to the needs of others, who had given freely to the poor, who had posted bonds for women in trouble, this was a cruel twist. Compassion had cost her, and now widowhood in truth, not just in name, deepened that cost. She bore the loss with the same dignity she had carried in earlier griefs. She did not retreat from the world. She continued her devotions, her work, her presence in the city, yet those who knew her must have seen the shadow in her eyes, the weariness of a woman who had carried too much. Even queens are not spared sorrow, and in her quiet moments she was simply a woman mourning her companion, counting coins against debts, wondering how to keep her household secure. The cottage on St. Anne Street, which had once felt full with the presence of Christophe and their children, grew heavier in his absence. The walls held his memory, the floors remembered his steps, the air still seemed to carry his voice. For Marie, every corner must have been a reminder of evenings shared in conversation, of laughter over children's play, of prayers spoken together. Now she walked those rooms alone, her strength tested not by ritual, but by loneliness. Outside, the city was restless. New Orleans in the 1850s was marked by growth and turmoil. Ships filled the river, commerce thrived, yet disease and poverty never ceased. The wealth of some was built upon the suffering of many, and the tensions between communities simmered beneath the surface. For Marie, whose compassion reached across boundaries, these tensions only deepened her work. Even as her own means diminished, she continued to give. It was not in her nature to close her door, even when hardship pressed against it. Her role as healer and queen persisted. People still came to her for remedies, for charms, for guidance. They still whispered her name with awe and fear. But those who saw her closely might have noticed the toll of years and of sorrow. The woman who had danced with the serpent and lifted torches at the bayou was aging now. Her steps slowed, her hair silvered, her body carried the weight of decades, yet her authority remained, rooted not in appearance, but in presence. The debts Christophe left behind became a lasting burden. Combined with her generosity, they ensured that she would never know wealth in her later years. She gave freely even when she had little to give. She continued to support orphans, to aid women in trouble, to comfort prisoners. She did not measure her compassion by what she could afford, but by what others needed. This, too, became part of her legend, the queen who was never rich, who lived in a modest cottage, who gave more than she kept. The grief of losing Christophe was not her first encounter with death, nor would it be her last. But it was perhaps her deepest, for it marked the end of a partnership that had sustained her through so many trials. With his passing, she was reminded of the fragility of all human ties, the inevitability of loss. And yet she did not falter. She continued. She endured. Like the drum that falls silent but waits to be lifted again, she carried on, her life still beating in rhythm with the city she served. Neighbors recalled her walking the streets even in these years, her head held high, her eyes calm. To them, she remained a figure of dignity, unshaken by sorrow. They may not have seen the quiet moments of fatigue, the nights when she sat alone by candlelight, remembering Christophe. But they saw enough to know that she was still a presence of strength, still a woman who embodied resilience. The death of her partner did not diminish her legend. If anything, it deepened it. For now, she was seen as one who carried not only the powers of spirits, but also the burdens of human life. She was both queen and widow, healer and mourner, servant of community and solitary soul. Her life was not untouched by sorrow, and that made her compassion all the more credible. In the silence of her cottage, as debts pressed and memories lingered, Marie continued to pray. The images of saints still stood in her home, candles still flickered in devotion, rosary beads still slipped through her fingers. She prayed not only for herself, but for her city, for the poor, for the sick, for the souls of the departed. Among those souls was now Christophe, her partner, whose absence was a wound no remedy could heal. The image of a woman kneeling alone in prayer captured this chapter of her life. A queen without her consort, a healer carrying her own grief, a woman both ordinary and extraordinary. In her solitude, she remained steadfast, her strength unbroken. The creak of an old chair beneath her weight echoed in the quiet room, a sound that marked the passage of years as surely as any drum or bell. It was the sound of age settling in, of a body grown weary, of a life moving toward its final chapters. And from that creak, the story flows onward into the years when she grew old, still present, still revered, even as her steps slowed and her strength waned. The old chair creaked beneath her as she settled into it, the wood groaning with the weight of years as much as with the weight of her body. It was a simple sound, ordinary, familiar. Yet in that creak was the story of age creeping gently upon her, of a body that had once danced with the serpent, now grown slower, stiffer, marked by time. Marie Laveau, once the widow Paris, once the companion of Christophe Glapion, once the queen who moved through firelit ceremonies with the grace of youth, was now an old woman. But even in her aging, she carried the dignity and presence that had long defined her. The years had furrowed her face, silvered her hair, slowed her step. Yet when she walked through the streets of the French Quarter, people still lowered their voices in respect. They still called her queen, still believed in her power, still sought her blessing. The authority she carried did not diminish with her physical strength. If anything, it deepened, for now she bore not only the aura of mystery, but the visible marks of endurance. She had lived through epidemics, wars, and endless sorrows, and still she remained. That survival itself was a form of power. Her daily life grew quieter, but no less devout. She continued to attend Mass at St. Louis Cathedral, her presence there so regular that she became as much a fixture as the candles or the altar itself. Parishioners saw her kneeling in prayer, her lips moving silently, her rosary beads passing steadily through her fingers. For some, it was proof that her strength came not from sorcery, but from faith. For others, it was evidence of her dual devotion, a woman who honored both the saints and the spirits with equal reverence. In her cottage on St. Anne Street, she maintained her small altars, surrounded by images of saints, candles, and offerings. Visitors still came, though perhaps fewer than in her younger years. They came seeking remedies, charms, or simply counsel from the woman whose wisdom was now sharpened by age. She listened with the same patience as before, her voice softer but no less assured. Her hands may have trembled slightly as she tied a gris-gris bag, but her followers believed the strength of her spirit had not waned. Age did not spare her from hardship. Her debts lingered, her resources remained modest, and her generosity continued to outpace her means. She gave when she could not afford to give, offering comfort even when her own life was austere. The creak of her chair echoed the creak of her finances, strained, fragile, yet still holding. She did not measure her worth by what she owned, but by what she gave, and in that measure she remained wealthy beyond count. Her family, too, was marked by time. Children had grown, some had passed, others lived quietly in the city, their lives intertwined with her own but less visible in legend. The mystery of Marie II lingered, some claiming that her daughter, or perhaps her granddaughter, had taken her place in certain ceremonies, extending the aura of her presence. Whether true or not, the stories reinforced the sense that her spirit was too large for one lifetime, that her role as queen could not belong to a single woman alone. Neighbors recalled her in these later years as gentle and approachable, often described as saintly. She was seen not as a figure of fear, but of reverence, an elder whose kindness touched all who came near. Writers of the time, even those who dismissed voodoo as superstition, often spoke of her with respect in her old age. Lafcadio Hearn, the journalist who later recorded much of Creole life, referred to her as one of the kindest women who ever lived. Such descriptions stood in sharp contrast to earlier accusations of sorcery and fraud. It was as if, with age, the city itself softened toward her, seeing more clearly the compassion that had always been at the heart of her life. Yet legends did not fade. Even as she sat quietly in her cottage, stories grew that she still held powers beyond explanation. Some said she could still command spirits with a glance, that her prayers could still bend fate, that misfortune awaited any who dared to offend her. Age had not diminished her aura in the eyes of the people. Instead, it added gravity, as if her long survival itself were proof of divine favor. Her twilight years were thus a mixture of solitude and reverence, of poverty and dignity, of ordinary routines and extraordinary reputation. She was at once a grandmotherly figure in her neighborhood and a legendary queen in the imagination of the city. Few figures in history managed to embody both so completely. At night, as she sat once more in her creaking chair, the cottage quiet around her, she may have reflected on the long path she had walked, from the child born in uncertain years, to the widow left to fend for herself, to the queen whose name carried both fear and reverence, to the elder now remembered with kindness. Her life had been a tapestry woven of contradictions. Perhaps she saw no contradiction at all, only the weaving of faith, compassion, and endurance into a single fabric. The chair creaked again as she shifted, and the sound echoed through the silence of the room. It was the sound of years, of age, of the steady approach of the final chapters. Yet it was not a sound of defeat. It was the sound of persistence, of a life still present, still watching, still waiting. And as she leaned back, eyes closing in prayer, two shadows crossed paths in the evening light outside her cottage, shadows that seemed to merge and divide again, hinting at mysteries yet unresolved, at the question of whether the queen's spirit truly ended with her or lived on in another who bore her name. Two shadows crossed paths in the evening light outside her cottage, merging and dividing again, as if they could not decide whether to be one or two. The neighbors who watched might have wondered the same about Marie herself. Was the woman they saw in later years still the same who had danced with the serpent in her youth, or had another taken her place? The legend of Marie II lingered in the streets like the perfume of magnolia on humid nights, difficult to grasp, impossible to dismiss. Some said that one of her daughters, or perhaps a granddaughter, bore such a striking resemblance to her that people could not tell them apart. When the elder Marie grew frail, this younger woman stepped into ceremonies, continuing the presence of the queen as if no years had passed. Others believed the queen herself had discovered some secret of longevity, that she walked the streets for decades without change, her features untouched by time. Still others whispered that spirits guarded her, preserving her body so that her reign could endure. The records do not resolve the question. Parish ledgers name her children, but they are fragmentary, filled with baptisms that end without follow-up, burials that leave no clear connections. Oral tradition offers more, but not with certainty. To this day, historians debate whether there truly was a second Marie who carried her name, or whether the people of New Orleans, unwilling to accept the fading of a legend, created one from their longing. What is certain is that confusion strengthened her aura. When a woman of color walked the streets in later years, upright, dignified, still commanding attention, people wondered, was this Marie the Elder or Marie the Younger? Did it matter? The line between fact and legend had blurred so thoroughly that the distinction ceased to be important. What endured was the name itself, repeated in awe, in fear, in devotion, Marie Laveau. The possibility of Marie no Rejado gave the queen's influence a kind of immortality. Even as the elder grew frail, the younger figure kept the aura alive, whether in reality or in rumor. Outsiders marveled at the continuity, astonished that she seemed never to age. Neighbors, accustomed to her presence, whispered of mysteries they dared not challenge. The legend of the queen, once born from rituals and whispers, now expanded into the realm of inheritance and identity, as if no single life could contain it. This doubling carried symbolic weight. In African traditions, lineage is sacred, and spirits move not only through individuals, but through families. To see Marie's image in her daughter was to see continuity, a reminder that her power did not belong to one person alone, but to a community, a heritage, a people. Whether by blood or by myth, the idea that her spirit could pass to another reflected a truth deeper than fact, that what she represented could not die with her. At the same time, the confusion fed the fascination of outsiders. Journalists wrote of her with uncertainty, unsure whether the queen they encountered was the same as the one they had heard of decades earlier. Visitors to the city repeated stories of seeing her walk the streets, unchanged, her presence as commanding as ever. To them she seemed eternal, a figure outside the ordinary laws of time. The myth of immortality, born of resemblance and rumor, grew stronger with each retelling. Within her cottage, the reality may have been simpler. An aging woman surrounded by family, cared for by those she had raised, carried on her daily devotions. A younger woman, perhaps a daughter or granddaughter, assisted with rituals, continued traditions, and bore the weight of resemblance. Together they created the impression of continuity. Yet even this simple truth would not erase the power of the legend, for people saw not two women, but one, enduring queen. The shadows outside her cottage captured this perfectly. One passed into the other, distinct yet united, separate yet inseparable. For those who believed, it was a sign that the queen could never die, that she would always be present in the city, her figure walking the streets long after others had vanished. This blending of fact and legend was not deception, but part of her power. For Marie, truth was never confined to records or documents. Truth was what people believed, what they carried in their hearts, what shaped their actions. If they believed she still walked the streets, then she did. If they believed her spirit moved through her children, then it did. Belief itself was reality, and in that reality her reign continued unbroken. Yet for Marie herself, aging quietly in her chair, the mystery of succession may have been less important than the simple duties of each day. She prayed, she counseled, she prepared remedies. She lived with dignity, accepting the frailties of age but not surrendering her presence. She may have smiled at the rumors, knowing that the truth mattered less than the faith it inspired. The shadows lengthened as the sun sank, stretching across the streets of the French Quarter, merging with the long memory of the city itself. And as the day faded, New Orleans continued to whisper her name, whether spoken of as one woman or two, as mortal or immortal, as saint or sorceress. The two shadows disappeared into the dusk, leaving the streets quiet once more. But in that quiet, another sound began to rise, the bells of St. Louis Cathedral ringing again, as they had rung at her birth, at her marriage, at her moments of grief. Now, in her aging years, they rang as if to remind her that time was passing, that the final chapters of her life were drawing near. The bells of St. Louis Cathedral rang again, their tones floating over the rooftops of the French Quarter, echoing against the narrow streets, dissolving into the wide curve of the Mississippi. For the people of New Orleans, the bells marked the rhythm of life itself: births, marriages, deaths, feast days, and fasts. For Marie, they had been the constant backdrop of her entire existence, sounding on the day of her birth, at her wedding, at the funerals of children and companions, and soon enough they would sound for her own departure. The city that heard those bells was not merely a stage for her story, but its inseparable partner. To understand Marie is to understand New Orleans, for her life was woven into its fabric as tightly as the cobblestones beneath its carriages. The French Quarter, where she was born and where she lived nearly all her years, was more than streets and buildings. It was a living organism, pulsing with voices, scents, and colors, carrying within it the contradictions that defined her. On mornings, the quarter filled with the cries of vendors. Women in bright headscarves balanced baskets on their heads, calling out in French and Creole, selling fruit, vegetables, and hot coffee mixed with chicory. Fishermen dragged their nets from the river, the smell of salt and fish clinging to their clothes. Children darted through narrow alleys, their laughter echoing off shuttered balconies. Above it all, iron balconies dripped with ferns, their railings patterned with delicate curves, like lace cast in metal. In the heat of midday, the air grew heavy with the perfume of magnolia and the tang of horse sweat from passing carriages. Merchants kept to the shade of their arcades, voices low, transactions careful. Priests in black cassocks walked slowly, blessing those who asked. At the corners, musicians struck up rhythms on fiddles and drums, blending African beats with French melodies, a music that was neither one nor the other, but something uniquely New Orleans. By evening, the streets softened under the glow of gas lamps. Families gathered in courtyards, the scent of gumbo rising from kitchens, laughter and song drifting upward into the night air. Lovers walked arm in arm along the levee, the great river rolling endlessly beside them, carrying barges toward the Gulf. And in the distance from Congo Square or the bayou, the sound of drums might rise again, faint but insistent, a reminder that the city was always listening to more than one rhythm at a time. This was the world that shaped Marie and that she, in turn, helped to shape. Her presence was not apart from the city, but within it, as ordinary as the market and as extraordinary as the cathedral. She was known not only in ceremonies or rituals, but in the daily fabric of life. Neighbors greeted her in the street. Children recognized her as the woman who prayed each morning in church. Merchants nodded to her as she passed, aware of the quiet authority she carried. To the city, she was both familiar and mysterious, a paradox that only deepened her legend. New Orleans itself seemed to mirror her contradictions. It was French and Spanish, African and American, Catholic and Protestant, enslaved and free. It was a place of wealth and elegance, with its grand houses and glittering balls, and also a place of poverty and suffering, with its crowded tenements and disease-ridden streets. It was a city where boundaries blurred, where categories dissolved, where people of different races and classes mingled more freely than elsewhere in the South. And it was in this space, this blurred line between worlds, that Marie found her place. The cathedral bells reminded her always of her Catholic devotion, yet the drums reminded her of her ancestral inheritance. The Mississippi brought commerce and prosperity, yet it also carried disease and death. The courtyards rang with music and laughter, yet the cemeteries overflowed with tombs, their walls thick with grief. Life and death, joy and sorrow, faith and fear. The city held them all, and so did she. As she grew older, the bond between her and New Orleans became less about ceremony and more about memory. People did not always see her leading rituals in her later years. Instead, they saw her presence as a symbol, a reminder of the city's endurance. To speak of Marie was to speak of New Orleans itself, its diversity, its resilience, its contradictions, its mysteries. Visitors to the city often remarked on her, though they could not always tell whether they had seen her or only heard stories. Some swore they encountered her walking the streets long after she should have been frail, still upright, still commanding attention. Others insisted she had passed her power to another. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. Her image became inseparable from the city's image. To outsiders, New Orleans meant jazz, gumbo, Mardi Gras, and Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen whose presence haunted its streets. At night, when the city grew quiet and gas lamps flickered against the damp air, the streets themselves seemed to carry her memory. The narrow alleys, the shuttered houses, the iron balconies, all seemed to whisper of her. The Mississippi rolled past in silence, its dark waters reflecting moonlight, its currents carrying away the secrets of the day. And somewhere, faintly, the cathedral bells rang again, as if to remind the city that time was passing, that no legend could outlast eternity. Yet New Orleans has always been a city where eternity feels closer than elsewhere. The cemeteries, with their above-ground tombs, keep the dead visible, their names carved in stone within sight of the living. In such a place, to live on after death is not unusual but expected. And so Marie, still alive in these years, was already part of that continuity, already spoken of as if she belonged as much to the past as to the present. The bells tolled once more, their sound deep and resonant, carrying into the night. And as they faded, they seemed to prepare for another tolling yet to come, one that would mark the end of her long life. For the final chapters were approaching, and soon the city that had shaped her and been shaped by her would gather to say farewell. The bells tolled into the night, their sound heavy, their rhythm slower than before, as if the great cathedral itself anticipated the silence that was soon to follow. For Marie Laveau, the queen whose name had echoed through the streets of New Orleans for more than 8 decades, the end was near. She had lived long enough to see the city change hands, long enough to bury companions and children, long enough to outlast wars and epidemics. Now, in her modest cottage on St. Anne Street, she prepared to depart, not with ceremony, but with the quiet dignity that had marked her life. It was June 15th, 1881. The summer heat pressed heavily against the city, the air thick and humid, carrying the scent of the river and the flowering trees. Inside the cottage, the shutters were drawn to soften the light. Candles flickered near the small altar adorned with images of saints, and the air was hushed with the solemnity of waiting. Family members and neighbors came and went, their steps soft, their voices lowered. They gathered not as followers of a queen, but as companions to an old woman who had touched their lives. Marie lay on her bed, her body frail, her breath shallow, her hands resting loosely atop a rosary. The same hands that had once braided hair, tied gris-gris bags, and lifted the serpent in ritual, now trembled faintly as she fingered the beads. Her lips moved silently in prayer, the familiar cadence of Hail Marys and Our Fathers rising like a rhythm more constant than drums. Faith, which had carried her through every chapter, carried her now into this final one. The city outside seemed aware of the moment. Neighbors lingered in doorways, glancing toward the cottage, whispering to one another. Children, hushed by their parents, peered curiously at the house of the woman whose name they had heard in stories. Some said the air itself was heavier, that the sky darkened though no storm clouds had gathered. Perhaps it was only imagination, but in a city that had long believed in mystery, imagination was never far from truth. Inside, her daughters and grandchildren tended to her with care. They dabbed her brow, whispered reassurances, prayed alongside her. They knew, as she must have known, that the end was not far, yet there was no panic, no despair, only solemnity, the kind that comes when a long life draws to a close and those who remain recognize that departure is both sorrow and release. Visitors came quietly to pay their respects. Some were women she had once counseled, who had come to her in their troubles and left with hope. Some were neighbors who remembered her kindness in times of sickness or grief. Some were strangers drawn by the weight of her reputation, eager to see for themselves the queen in her final hours. All were received with the same composure, for even in weakness, Marie carried the dignity of presence. As the hours passed, the sounds of the city drifted into the cottage, the call of vendors in the street, the creak of carriage wheels, the tolling of bells marking the hour. Each sound was a reminder of the life she had lived within these walls, surrounded by the rhythm of New Orleans. She had never left it, and now she would depart within it, her story inseparable from its streets and people. Near sunset, her breathing grew fainter. The candles burned lower, their flames steady but dim. Family gathered closer, their prayers louder, filling the room with murmured faith. Some said that as she passed, the air grew suddenly lighter, that a peace settled upon the cottage, that her final breath was not an end, but a release. At that moment, the bells of the cathedral tolled once more, as if to carry her soul upward in sound. Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, was gone. She had lived more than 80 years, a remarkable span in a city marked by disease and hardship. She had walked through epidemics, wars, prejudice, and poverty, and still endured. She had been called sorceress, saint, fraud, and queen, and yet she had never ceased to be herself, a woman of devotion, compassion, and strength. Word of her passing spread quickly through the city. By morning, crowds gathered near the cottage, people of all colors and classes, rich and poor alike. They spoke of her with reverence, with sorrow, with awe. Some called her a saint who had nursed the sick and comforted the condemned. Others spoke of her powers, of rituals and charms, of mysteries that would never be explained. All agreed that the city had lost one of its most unforgettable figures. In those hours after her death, stories began to multiply. Some said they saw her spirit walking the streets that very night, her figure moving with the same calm authority as always. Others claimed to have heard her voice in their dreams, or to have felt her presence at their side. The queen, it seemed, was not gone but transformed, shifting from flesh into legend, from presence into memory. Her body was prepared with care, dressed simply, and carried to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, where her family tomb awaited. As the procession moved through the streets, crowds joined, following in silence. Some wept, some prayed, some whispered her name as if invoking it one last time. The cathedral bells tolled yet again, their sound mingling with the footsteps of mourners. The tomb was whitewashed and plain, yet it soon became one of the most visited in the cemetery. People pressed close to it, touching the stone, leaving offerings, marking it with symbols of devotion. Even in death, she remained a presence, her grave becoming a shrine where the living sought connection with the queen they had known or imagined. The bells tolled once more, then fell silent, leaving only the murmur of the crowd and the soft rustle of wind among the tombs. Yet in that silence, her story did not end. It lingered in the streets, in the songs, in the prayers, in the very air of New Orleans. And from the silence of the cemetery rose another sound, faint but steady, the scratching of chalk against stone, the hands of visitors marking her tomb with signs and letters, seeking her blessing even beyond the grave. The scratching of chalk against stone lingered in the humid air of the cemetery, the soft rasp of marks being traced upon her tomb. Some drew crosses, others initials, still others mysterious symbols handed down through generations. Each gesture was a plea, a petition, a hope that Marie Laveau, even in death, would hear and intercede. Her grave, plain in its whitewashed simplicity, was already becoming more than a resting place. It was becoming a shrine. But before the chalk and the offerings, before the endless stream of visitors, there had been her funeral, a day unlike any other in New Orleans. When the news of her death spread on June 15, 1881, it traveled quickly through the city's streets. By dawn, the French Quarter buzzed with murmurs. The Queen was gone. Some spoke her name with sorrow, others with reverence, still others with unease, yet all felt that a figure larger than life had departed, leaving the city changed. Her funeral drew a crowd as diverse as the city itself. White and black, rich and poor, Catholic parishioners and followers of Voodoo, all gathered to pay their respects. Some came dressed in finery, others in humble clothes, but in the press of the crowd, distinctions of class and color blurred. The streets near St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 were filled with people, thousands pressing shoulder to shoulder, waiting for a glimpse of her passing. Accounts from the time described the funeral as both solemn and extraordinary. Reporters noted the sheer scale of attendance, the mixture of people rarely seen together in public, the reverence with which they followed her body. For a woman who had lived at the margins of respectability, accused of sorcery, dismissed as a fraud, condemned by prejudice, the funeral itself became her vindication. The city, in all its diversity, acknowledged her. Her coffin was borne through the streets to the cemetery, accompanied by prayers, chants, and silent tears. The cathedral bells tolled in the distance, echoing against the walls of the quarter. Some said the sound was softer than usual, as if muted in respect. Others said it was louder, proclaiming her passage with unusual force. Perhaps both were true, for memory often reshapes sound to match the depth of feeling. At the cemetery, the crowd pressed close, surrounding the whitewashed tomb that would hold her body. Words of prayer were spoken, rosaries fingered, candles lit. Flowers were laid, some from gardens, others gathered from the streets. The air was heavy with incense and magnolia, the mingling of ritual and nature, faith and tradition. When the coffin was placed within the tomb, silence fell for a moment, broken only by the sighs and muffled sobs of those nearest. Then, as if on cue, the murmurs began again. Stories whispered, prayers offered, promises made. It was not the end of a life, but the beginning of a legacy, and the crowd seemed to know it. From that day forward, her tomb became a place of pilgrimage. People came not only to mourn, but to seek her aid. They touched the stone, left coins, flowers or candles, and marked symbols upon its surface. Some traced 3 X's, a sign of petition. Others wrote their names or initials, hoping to tie themselves to her enduring power. Over time, the tomb grew thick with these markings, layers upon layers of devotion and desperation. The offerings varied. Coins glimmered in the dust. Small bottles of rum were left at the base. Pieces of cloth, beads, and herbs were tucked into cracks. Each object carried meaning, a sign of faith that Marie, even beyond death, still listened. The Catholic saints had their statues and candles, but Marie had her tomb, where people came to pray not only for intercession, but for protection, love, fortune, or revenge. Tourists began to hear of it, curious about the Queen whose grave drew such devotion. Writers recorded their impressions, sometimes mocking, sometimes awed. For the people of New Orleans, however, it was not curiosity, but continuity. To them, she was still present, still active, still watching over the city she had served. In time, stories multiplied. Some swore they saw her spirit walking the cemetery, her figure moving among the tombs at night. Others claimed she appeared in dreams, offering guidance or warning. A few even said they had seen her at her cottage long after her death, as if she had never left. Such stories blurred the line between memory and haunting, between history and myth. Yet for New Orleans, a city where the dead are always near, they seemed entirely natural. The scratching of chalk against her tomb became the most enduring ritual. Generations repeated it, each mark renewing the bond between the living and the queen. The tomb itself bore witness, its surface covered in signs, its whitewash worn thin by devotion. It became, like the cathedral or the river, one of the city's landmarks, a place where faith and legend intertwined. To stand before it was to feel the presence of more than stone. It was to feel the weight of memory, the persistence of belief, the endurance of a woman who had lived beyond the categories imposed upon her. She had been saint and sorceress, fraud and queen, healer and prisoner's friend. In death, she became all of them and more. Her legend magnified by devotion, her story inseparable from the city itself. The chalk scratched again, another X marked upon the stone, and as the dust of it fell, mingling with the offerings below, the city seemed to lean closer, listening for a response. For though she had passed, the queen still spoke in silence, still answered in whispers, still lived in the faith of those who sought her. And from the stone of the tomb, cold and unyielding, another sound emerged, the shuffle of countless feet walking away, leaving behind their offerings, their prayers, their marks. Each footstep carried her further into legend until the woman who had lived in a modest cottage was transformed into one of the most enduring figures of American folklore. The shuffle of countless feet faded along the cemetery's paths, yet the silence they left behind was not emptiness. It was filled with memory, with the presence of the queen whose story would not remain confined to stone. Death had not ended Marie Laveau's reign. It had merely transformed it. Where once her power was carried by whispers in the French Quarter, it now spread across the wider world through song, tale, and printed word. She had passed from history into legend, and in legend she grew larger than she had ever been in life. The first to carry her name beyond the city were the journalists of her own time. Some wrote of her funeral, describing the crowds, the reverence, the extraordinary gathering of rich and poor. Others looked back on her life with prejudice, reducing her rituals to exotic spectacle or condemning her as a fraud. Yet even in their condemnation, they could not deny her influence. To dismiss her required acknowledging her, and thus her story remained alive in ink as well as in memory. By the late 19th century, as New Orleans sought to present itself as a city of romance and mystery, Marie's name became useful to those who wished to tell tales of the strange and the supernatural. Writers embroidered her life with details drawn more from imagination than fact. They described her as an immortal sorceress, her beauty untouched by time, her powers undiminished. They placed her in scenes of midnight rituals and shadowed ceremonies filled with serpents and fire. Truth and invention mingled until they were indistinguishable, and the queen became as much a figure of Gothic fantasy as of Creole memory. In the early 20th century, Lafcadio Hearn and other chroniclers of Creole life wrote of her with a gentler tone. They remembered her compassion, her service to the sick and the imprisoned, her saintly presence in old age. To them, she was less a sorceress than a figure of charity, a woman whose life reflected the blending of Catholic devotion and Creole tradition. Yet even they did not resist the pull of myth, repeating stories that hinted at powers beyond the natural. The queen was always both, healer and sorceress, saint and witch, depending on who spoke her name. As the decades passed, her legend moved into music. Blues singers called upon her in their lyrics, invoking her name as a symbol of power and mystery. In rhythm and rhyme, she became the embodiment of New Orleans' spirit, a figure who could bring luck or doom with a word. Jazz musicians wove her into their stories, linking her to the city's pulsing heartbeat of sound. Through music, she reached audiences far from Louisiana. her name carried on melodies as enduring as the Mississippi itself. In the mid-20th century, as American culture grew fascinated with the occult and the exotic, her legend was reshaped again. Popular writers portrayed her as a dark sorceress, a queen of shadows who ruled through fear and spells. Films and novels placed her in stories of ghosts, curses, and forbidden rites. Tour guides in New Orleans told visitors of her as if she were still alive, leading them to her tomb, recounting tales of her immortal presence. These exaggerations often bore little resemblance to the woman who had lived and prayed in a modest cottage, yet they ensured her name never faded. The truth of Marie Laveau's life was simpler, yet no less extraordinary. She was a free woman of color who became a hairdresser, confidant, healer, and spiritual leader. She attended Mass daily, prayed with the condemned, aided the poor, and offered remedies rooted in both African tradition and Catholic faith. Her authority came not from spectacle, but from compassion, not from terror, but from trust. Yet the legend that grew around her was shaped less by truth than by the needs and imaginations of those who remembered her. For the people of New Orleans, her legend served as continuity. She remained a symbol of resilience, of cultural blending, of the city's refusal to be defined by outsiders. To speak of Marie was to speak of New Orleans itself, mysterious, diverse, proud, and enduring. For outsiders, her legend became a way to imagine the city as a place of enchantment and danger, a city where spirits walked and rituals ruled. In both cases, she was essential, her name a thread woven into the fabric of identity. At her tomb, the legend and the truth continued to meet. Visitors left offerings in the hope of her blessing, believing she still had power to intercede. Scholars tried to separate fact from fiction, but even their work could not strip away the aura. Every mark of chalk, every coin left on the stone, every whispered prayer testified that the queen still reigned in memory, whatever the records might say. The shuffle of feet leaving her tomb was never the end. More feet always followed. More hands touched the stone. More voices spoke her name. The queen had become timeless, her story unending, her presence inseparable from the city that bore her. And yet, as the 20th century drew on, the voices grew louder still, carried not only by music and story, but by the new mediums of film, television, and popular culture. The queen who had once walked the streets of the French Quarter now walked the screens and pages of the modern world, her image reshaped again for new audiences. The shuffle of feet faded, replaced by the flicker of screens, the turn of pages, the rise of songs, and from that flicker rose a new chapter in which Marie Laveau, long gone from her cottage, became an icon not only of New Orleans, but of the imagination of the wider world. The flicker of screens, the turn of pages, the rise of songs, all carried her name forward into a world she could never have imagined. Marie Laveau, who had once walked quietly through the narrow streets of New Orleans, now walked across the stages of history, folklore, and popular imagination. In each retelling, she was reshaped, but always, unmistakably, she remained the queen of New Orleans voodoo. In the songs of bluesmen and jazz musicians, her name was invoked as a symbol of mystery and power. Her figure was evoked in lyrics that spoke of charms, of spells, of fortunes turned. To sing her name was to conjure the essence of New Orleans itself, a city forever tied to rhythm and ritual. Musicians, knowingly or not, carried her aura into clubs and concert halls, far from the bayous and squares where her real voice had once been heard. In literature, she appeared again and again, each author dressing her in new garments. Some made her a dark sorceress, feared and unyielding. Others painted her as a wise woman, a healer, almost saint-like in her compassion. Historical novels and Gothic tales alike found room for her, for she was the kind of figure who could never be confined to one interpretation. In her, writers found the very contradictions that made New Orleans a subject of endless fascination: beauty and decay, faith and superstition, reverence and fear. On the stage and screen, her presence expanded further. Films portrayed her as a mysterious enchantress. Television shows wove her into plots filled with intrigue and spirits. Sometimes her image was distorted, shaped to fit the needs of drama. Yet always, the essence of her legend persisted. The aura of a woman who commanded respect, who blurred the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Even when exaggerated, the Queen endured. Tourism embraced her as well. Guides led visitors through the French Quarter, stopping at her cottage on St. Anne Street, pointing out her tomb in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. Stories spilled into the humid air, some drawn from fact, others from imagination, all woven together in the rich tapestry of legend. Visitors listened wide-eyed, carried away by the idea that a single woman could still hold such sway over a city more than a century after her death. They left tokens at her grave, hoping for blessings, as countless before them had done. Scholars, too, turned their attention to her, sifting through baptismal records, legal documents, and newspaper accounts, seeking the woman behind the myth. They pieced together her life as best they could, separating fact from fiction where possible. Yet even scholarship could not fully unravel the legend. For every record clarified, another story emerged, reminding them that Marie Laveau's truth was not only in documents, but in belief. To understand her was to understand that myth itself is a form of reality, one that shapes lives and endures across generations. Today, her name is spoken as easily as any saint's, her story told in classrooms, museums, and living rooms. She is remembered not only as a voodoo queen, but as a healer, a mother, a neighbor, a woman of faith. Some light candles before her tomb, asking for intercession. Others read about her in novels or hear her name in songs, finding inspiration in the idea of her presence. Each encounter, however small, adds another layer to her legacy. Yet perhaps the truest legacy lies not in the stories told by outsiders, but in the quiet memory of the community she served, in the recollections of free women of color whose bonds she once posted, in the gratitude of prisoners who received her prayers, in the whispered thanks of mothers whose children she comforted, in the unseen lines of resilience that stretch through New Orleans itself, a city still marked by diversity, contradiction, and endurance. Her tomb, though often marked and remarked upon, remains the clearest symbol of this continuity. It stands in the oldest of the city's cemeteries, among the whitewashed vaults and crumbling stones, where the dead are as visible as the living. There, visitors trace their marks, leave their offerings, whisper their petitions. The stone is worn smooth in places, the chalk symbols washed away and renewed again and again. Each gesture affirms that the Queen still reigns, not in flesh, but in faith. As the years lengthen, as the city grows and changes, her story remains a constant thread. Tourists may come and go, scholars may debate, musicians may sing, films may portray her in new guises. Yet in the end, the truth of Marie Laveau is found in the same place it always was, in the belief of the people, in the memory of a city that will not let her name fade. On quiet nights when the cathedral bells toll and the river moves slowly past, it is said that her presence can still be felt, perhaps in the hush of a courtyard, in the faint sound of drums carried on the wind, in the flicker of a candle at a windowsill. Not as a ghost to be feared, but as a reminder of a life lived with faith, resilience, and compassion, a life that became legend. And so the story ends, as it began, with sound. The tolling of bells. They ring now not for her passing, but for her endurance, for the Queen who lived and died in New Orleans, yet who lives still in its memory. The bells fade into silence, leaving only the pulse of the city, eternal, rhythmic, unbroken. And within that pulse, her name lingers, Marie Laveau, the Queen of New Orleans.